The slave in the photo, Peter, was confined to a bed for 2 months after the beating at the hands of his master. This abuse in society is where African Americans began in the United States hundreds of years before equality could be obtained. These former slaves worked as teamsters under General Benjamin Franklin Butler during his 1864 command of the Bermuda Hundred near Richmond, Virginia. African Americans were allowed to serve in the military for the Union during the Civil War. The Confederates only used black soldiers once their situation became dependent upon it. Still, both armies used black soldiers only as expendable pawns on the front lines of battle. This graphic photo shows the result of the all-too-common lynchings in the Old South. The only thing more haunting than the beaten, lifeless corpses hanging from the tree are the smiles and casual attitudes of the crowd watching below. This photo shows how prominent signs were in public places separating the races. The Democratic Jim Crow laws made sure not only to legally mandate segregation, but to also constantly remind blacks of their inferior status in the antebellum South. Sharecroppers in the 1930s were still struggling with the harsh conditions of their environment. Even after the demise of slavery, many blacks in the South still only managed to barely survive in hard labor, with little reward in the sharecropping system. The poor living conditions still encouraged African Americans to rise above their situations and aspire to more out of life. This packed courthouse waited for a verdict to be reached regarding segregation in public schools in Virginia. This many people attended, waving Confederate flags, hoping that the division between the races and the oppression of African Americans would continue long after slavery had officially ended. The SCLC protested in the heavily segregated city of Birmingham, Alabama in 1963. The city was often referred to as Bombingham and Dynamite Hill because of the massive terrorist bombings of black establishments to, quote, keep them in their place. After Kennedy's national address calling for equality to African Americans led to even more violent opposition, over 200,000 protesters marched the streets of Washington to the steps of the Lincoln Monument to hear speeches from civil rights leaders. No one figure represented the civil rights movement more than Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. His most famous speech, "I Have a Dream," from the Freedom March is, to many, the most emotional and iconic summation of the plight of African Americans for equality in the United States.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
The speech reinvigorated and inspired movement activists, as well as the country itself. After the assassination of JFK, President Lyndon B. Johnson used his public support and presidential power to help push the Civil Rights Act of 1964 through Congress, effectively eliminating the segregation enforced by the Jim Crow laws. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. occurred on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee on April 4, 1968. His murder set off violent riots in cities across the United States and fueled the fires of hatred between the races, despite King's own wishes for peace.
Not quite enough cigarettes to calm me down.